welcome to Mooney Reads. Today I'm going to talk about the books that I read in the second half of January. If you want to hear about the books that I read in the first half of the month, you can check out my mid-month wrap-up. So I started out actually reading some pamphlets. I'm not sure, so far as book count and stuff, if some people would count some things that are this small, but I read them, so I'm going to talk about them. These pamphlets I found through Publishers for Palestine. They actually have a really cool resource with a bunch of free zines, as well as information about books that are free as well, like a collection of ebooks that other publishers have put out. So these are some that I read from that selection that they've supplied. There's this smaller one called Palestinian Artists, and this is from the Gliese Art Collective, who are on Instagram, and it looks like this might have been one of the first things that they put out, or it's at least one of the first things on their Instagram, but they have some other neat looking zines kind of talking about art, and it's illustrated. It's got information, kind of a short history, and then stuff on the Palestinian flag before going in and talking about different artists and stuff. And so it's kind of a way to find out a little bit and kind of know who to look for from there. And the other two that I read were both from, I found both of these still through the Publishers for Palestine, but the people who put them out are librarians and activists with Palestine. The first one was on prisons, books in prisons. This is specifically looking at a collection that's now at a public library, and this zine talks a little bit about what education, access to education looks like in Israeli prisons for Palestinians, and kind of the issues that they've had getting books. They don't have access to any educational programs and have been limited in the number of books that they can bring in. Of course, this is from 2014, and it's looking even in the past from there. So this is not current, but it's at least what they did kind of deal with. And there are a bunch of really neat pictures of the books that were in there that the people who were imprisoned looked after. That was my cat knocking over a whole pile of books, if y'all could hear that. And then I read Overdue books, Returning Palestine's Abandoned Property of 1948. And this one is a lot longer and was a part of research that the author was a part of. Different versions of this information have also been published in academic articles. And she worked, I think, alongside some of the people who were doing some of the interviews for The Great Book Robbery, which I watched right after reading this. They both look at books that were taken from Palestinian homes immediately after the Nakba. In this particular paper, she talks about that issue and also even includes little bits from some people who were impacted by it, including Mohammed Batrawi's experience, which was horrific and not something I think I'm ever going to forget. He talks about actually, as a prisoner of war, having to go into Palestinian homes and collect items, under the watch of Israeli soldiers, and actually ends up going to his own home. It's just another level of cruelty that's just, I would say, unimaginable, but it's happened. So she talks a little bit about his experience, but I would also really recommend watching the documentary. He's not the only person that they interview in the documentary at all, and you can see how this sort of thing affects people on so many different levels. But the whole purpose of them taking the books were initially to, at least they say, to be able to give it back to them but also with the understanding that the library would probably keep most of them. The Israeli library would keep most of them. And so they're looking at this collection of books and what's been returned, and the process that would entail if someone were to want to get their books back. After talking about this as well, this paper also goes into talking about the role of taking items like this in other genocides, specifically talking about the Holocaust. This was really informative and really important, especially talking about like censorship and book bannings and whatnot. I feel like this is definitely adjacent to a lot of this. People's books are literally being taken along with literally everything else that they have. But actually in the documentary, someone who is a Palestinian author kind of talks about the impact of that on him specifically, not even knowing that there was, he knew about some of the people who'd written maybe in the 60s and 70s, but the people who were writing earlier he didn't know about until much later. Of the three that I read, that one left the biggest impression on me, and I would definitely recommend reading this and then watching the documentary. Obviously they pair well together because they're talking about the same thing, but I think that with this framing, looking at also this in context with other genocides, is really enlightening and was a good way to start the documentary. And then after I read those zines, we're going to go to a just complete vibe shift. I read Heartstopper Volume 5, which was very good. I won't say too much about the plot because this is the 5th volume, but I thought it was good. I think that they handled the things that they had to handle pretty well. There was a part of it that felt like it feels like we're waiting on things. And I know that's kind of, a part of this. They're trying to figure certain things out. But in a way, this kind of felt like, it's not totally like filler because it wasn't that empty. But it feels like we're waiting on stuff to kind of happen in volume 6 for a part of it, if that makes sense. I don't know. It was still really good. It had a lot of cute stuff. It's Heartstopper. It's gonna be good. It was good. After that, I read Unfamiliar Volume 2. And this one I read the first volume of maybe in November. I read it in November. The series follows a witch who moves to a new town only to discover that the house that she moved into is extremely haunted, and she only knows kitchen magic. She's a kitchen witch, so she decides that she needs to go into town and make friends so that they can help her exorcise these ghosts. And moving into the 2nd volume, we're focused kind of more on these friends. In particular, it focuses in, I think for the most part, on these two. I never remember any characters' names, but very helpfully they put a little bit with the characters' names at the very front of the book. So we're mostly focused on Babs and Son, and kind of the things that they're dealing with, although the ghost stuff is also still happening, kind of in the background. I really love this. It is adorable with like creepy stuff kind of put in, but I think at the end of the day it's not like the imminent death and stuff like that isn't really that serious, which I think I just really like that's why I really enjoyed Twistwood Tales when I read it last year, and there are several other examples of stories I can think of that have that kind of mix of the light and dark. The artwork is cutesy, and like I said, I feel like the kind of dark stuff in it doesn't really feel that serious, but it's still well done, and we're seeing some like character development and some of the stuff that's actually happening with the ghosts is neat. Like, I think there's the base level of the way that they end up going about it is kind of unique. I can't really be more specific without spoilers. I really like it. It's got more depth than I would expect, but it's also not that, I was gonna say not that deep, but not that high stakes. The next book that I read was Squire, which is a young adult graphic novel. And that the last two were also young adult. This one is, I think it's technically fantasy, but there aren't really fantastical elements. It's more like historical fiction, but in a fake place. But this focuses on this girl who comes from a group of people who are basically seen as the lowest class within this particular society. She decides that she wants to become a squire, which is like a second hand to a knight, in order to gain citizenship and kind of do things differently. She doesn't just want to live on a farm her whole life. She wants to go out, have adventure, make a name for herself, sort of. And this is her foray into that, like I said, as a marginalized person in this society. And you can sort of start to see the seams, I think, pretty quickly within the military. And there are a lot of parallels to what's happening here and things in real life. One of the characters is one of the authors is from Jordan and the other one is from Palestine. And you can kind of see that history, directly or reflected in kind of what they're talking about. I think that this was really well done. I like a lot of the characters. The main character, her, main friend that she kind of makes pretty early on. There are parts of it that I wish that we would have been able to spend more time with, and things that I think could have been fleshed out further. However, I think that I also think that with every high concept YA graphic novel that I read that is a standalone, I still gave this 5 stars. And actually the other book that I'm thinking about that I thought that same thing about is Across the Field of Starlight, which I also, I think, gave 5 stars to and was my favorite graphic novel the year that I read it. So that's not anything necessarily negative to anyone other than probably the publishing industry that restricts them to, a standalone rather than giving them the space with like a trilogy or something, or were they paid, adequately and stuff like that for their time. But anyways, this was very good, very well thought out, and really great art, cool characters. Yeah. After that, I read Palestinian Walks, Forays into a Vanishing Landscape by Rasha Shehade. And this was a memoir, so we're switching gears back to nonfiction. And he frames this memoir with, I think, 6 different walks that he takes in the hills of Palestine, all throughout different parts of his life. And while he's describing these walks, you're also getting different parts of his life. He talks about his, I think they're his grandparents, and or his parents, I think his grandparents, yeah. He talks about his grandparents kind of building what they built, in the foothills of Palestine, bringing his nephews to it. He also talks about his work as a lawyer. Before the Oslo Accords, he was a lawyer who tried to work through the Israeli government to get Palestinians to be able to keep their land, because the land wasn't unused. It wasn't, any of these things. It wasn't just sitting there. It was owned by someone. And he thought that if he could go through all of the legal steps, that they would see very clearly, of course, of course these belong to people, that it would poke holes in their argument, and then they would no longer be able to do this. Then the Oslo Accords happened, which meant that a lot of the land that he'd been fighting around was kind of given up in a way because of the way that they drew the lines. The stuff that he did was never really accounted for, in terms of the way that he was like looking at the law and stuff, because now all of it was changed. So it goes into an awful lot of different things. Throughout it, you can kind of see how he changes as well, kind of going from someone who is very, you know, adamant, kind of going through this one particular way, and then having to kind of grapple with the fact that that particular way didn't really work in this circumstance, and then him having to figure out how to deal with that, how to cope with that. I think it was really well written. I think that framing it with these different walks was really good. I will say it doesn't, while he does talk, you know, in detail about the things that he talks about, there's some stuff, like, it's not a history book. It's not going to give you every single little kind of detail, so you will have to maybe do a little bit of research if you're not familiar with Palestinian history at all. But I mean, I think you can still make your way through the memoir pretty fine without knowing those details. But it was a very good book. It was published in 2008. I think that they recently made the audiobook, which is how I listened to it. But it was originally published in 2008. And I was almost expecting to kind of see connections to now, like, in the text, like, not, I think I didn't really look at when it was released necessarily, but just with the way that he said certain things, it felt like it was foreshadowing for talking about current events. And I knew that the most current events wouldn't be in a book that had been published, but with the way that events played out and some of the perspectives of people that he talked to, it could very well have, you know, he could just add in a couple more essays and he wouldn't have to do much of anything to draw, you know, to where things are currently, which is very sad. But I think, you know, if you're looking to read more Palestinian books, especially to understand what's been going on, this one is really good. It's a really well done memoir. So those are all of the things that I finished reading in the second half of January. There are some other books that I worked on or started as well. I am still making my way through What's Your Pronoun? Beyond He and She by Dennis Barron. I really haven't read too terribly much since in the second half of the month. I read the first 2 chapters in the first half of the month, and I think I've read maybe a half a chapter. But it's neat. The chapter that I'm on now is actually looking at all of these different alternative pronouns that were suggested, you know, in the earlier years. So starting back in, I think the earliest that he had was the late 1700s through the 1800s and early 1900s. And it's so interesting hearing the rhetoric around it, because so much of it really is them kind of like blaming, at least a fair amount of them, like blaming women and women's lib for this need for a new pronoun, but it's also like a bunch of, you know, white dudes that are suggesting it too while complaining about it. And it's just funny, but also not funny. I think that it really shows how these small, like, it's not insignificant because language that we're using is very important, but in the grand scheme of things, you know, looking at human rights, it's funny how they're blaming women and women's lib for all of this stuff, and then also seeing now how we have like trans people and like pronouns being seen as this like central issue too. And not that pronouns aren't like important, but in the grand scheme of things, let's be kind of serious for a second. Like, these people are acting like the sanctity of the human language is at stake. So basically it's great to know that time is a circle, a flat circle that doesn't actually change at all. So anyways, that's interesting. I talked way too much about that to have only read like 20 more pages, but I am also working my way through Reese Halbach's On Collective Memory. Thus far, I've only gotten through the introduction, which is actually really useful because it talks about who he was and kind of some of the general things that his different big works went through, and the impression that he's made, the sort of research that came after him. The biography information was very interesting, and also seeing how he, I guess to start with, he was a sociologist, and his I think he is said to have coined kind of the term collective memory, although I've watched a lecture about how that's maybe not necessarily the totally correct sort of version of history because of how people like to talk about memory studies. But he was a sociologist who studied under Durkheim, who I am familiar with, but it was interesting to see how he sort of differed a little bit and where he came from beforehand. I will say the end of the introduction, there was some weird stuff happening. She actually does specifically bring up Palestine, but like the way that she started and the way that she, with the place that she ended up, was not what I was expecting, but I don't know what else to expect in academia, but to be at least a little disappointed at some of the conclusions that we come to, or that people end up coming to. I'm interested to actually get into his writing because the introduction was from the person who translated him. I don't believe I actually heard of him at all when I was in school for sociology, but I also didn't really do very much with memory studies, and I don't think that all of his stuff is translated into English. He wrote in French. There's that. And the last thing that I started was Imagination, a Manifesto, which I started today. I've only read a little bit on. It is a new release. My copy came in early. It technically doesn't come out until February, but it's really cool. It's basically imagining what a world would be like, without prisons, like what, in order to like kind of achieve the world that we want, we first have to imagine it. The author takes the Toni Morrison quote, "Dream a little before you think," and is doing that dreaming. And thus far, she's starting out the book talking about how people, or more specifically Black people, are restricted, especially within schools, how schools are kind of like drain the imagination out of people, or are set up basically for most people to not be able to dream in these specific ways to be able to change things. So that's kind of where we're starting. I'm really looking forward to the rest of it because it sounds so cool. I'm actually reading this for a vlog, so you'll get more of my thoughts in that. Hopefully it'll be out sometime this year. Really, sometime before the end of February, really. After filming that, I realized that I forgot a couple of the audiobooks that I've been reading. So literally the last day of January, I started The Honeys by Ryan Lasala, which is really great so far. I'm already a third of the way into it. I think I was reading it for like almost 4 hours or something like that. Three or 4 hours. Granted not on 1.5 times speed, but it's very good. It's like a thriller, horror, young adult book, with a genderqueer main character. I've been meaning to read it for a long time. I got the ARC forever ago, and I've actually had the audiobook from the library a couple of times, and I only just now started it. I don't know why it took me so long because I have been excited for it, but I'm glad that I started it now because I'm really enjoying it. And then I actually have one what I would consider like an actual DNF. I regularly stop books for different reasons and tend to come back to them later. But this one I actually just DNF'd, and that is Heaven and Earth's Grocery Store. There wasn't anything particularly like, you know, awful or bad or whatever, but I only picked it up because it was the Barnes and Noble book of the year, and I just wanted to see what it was. And the very beginning of it was interesting, and then we start to dig into the stories of these different people, and there is a lot of them, and it's whatever. And I would have probably kept going, but I talked to my coworker who also read the audiobook, and the stuff that she had to say about it made me not really want to read it. And one of the things she said is that the cast of characters is huge, and it was really hard to keep up with everybody. And you know, I was talking to her about what I like about more like character focused books, and she was like, yeah, you don't really get that kind of amount of depth. It's just kind of a lot of people. And then she told me something else about the end that was just not very satisfying. And so I just decided to put it down, because I only picked it up because it was the Barnes & Noble book of the year. I mean, it does sound like relatively interesting, but there are so many other books that sound more interesting that don't have like specific things that I know I wouldn't like in it. So if you've read it and you think that it's really good, or you know, whatever, I wouldn't be opposed to picking it back up. It's not like it was terrible, but I did stop reading it. So anyways, that is what I read the second half of February, or no, second half of January. That is what I read the second half of January. In the comments, let me know if you've read any of these or what you've been reading in January. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.